Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the California Transportation Secretary Biden-Harris Port Envoy Media Briefing. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question-and-answer session, and instructions will be given at that time. If you should require assistance during the call, please press star, then 0. As a reminder, this call is being recorded. I would now like to turn the conference over to our host, John D. Porcari. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, and welcome, everyone. I'm John Porcari, the White House Ports Envoy, and I'm here with my colleague and friend, Secretary David Kim of the California State Transportation Agency. We have, I think, significant news here today on some of the longer-term efforts. I wanted to first just remind everyone that our work on the supply chain and ports in particular is twofold. First, in the short term, to have a laser-like focus on operational improvements that can enhance the short-term performance, in particular of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Those series of improvements are underway. We have more to come as well. While we're doing that, we want to make sure that we're building a strong foundation for the future as well. The pandemic laid bare the reality that our goods movement chain could barely function in a steady state, but when subjected to a stress like the pandemic, clearly could not keep up. And so rebuilding a more resilient private sector supply chain, one that can withstand those kind of shocks and serve the future economy with more fluidity and velocity is really the goal. So the first step toward that is today's agreement between the federal government and the state of California. It's called an Emerging Projects Agreement, and it's a way for the state with federal financial and credit assistance to build a program of projects that start to get into the backlog of infrastructure improvements that are holding back our goods movement chain. It's a hunting license, if you will, to build that comprehensive program of projects that will serve both the state and the nation well in the long term. We'll get into the specifics of it, but it's the kind of projects that may not get as much attention, but are really crucial for goods movement, both within the ports and, importantly, beyond the fence line of the ports. Things like highway upgrades to improve truck travel times, grade-separated crossings for railroad, Class 1 railroads, land ports of entry to expand export and import capacity, and a whole host of other projects that can be done. The Emerging Projects Agreement takes the two premier loan programs of the federal government's infrastructure program, TIFIA and RIF, and allocates that capacity on a blanket basis to the state of California to develop a comprehensive program of projects. And I would finally note that this is perfect timing for this discussion, as you've heard from President Biden, both through the campaign trail and as president, that we're not doing right by the next generation in terms of infrastructure. And if you look at our ports, if you look at the inland goods movement, whether it's rail, truck, if you look at the warehousing and distribution portions of it, both the private and the public infrastructure, it's in some cases it's your grandparents' infrastructure, but it's today's needs. And this agreement, which is the first of its kind, is actually an example of how we could take the infrastructure proposal that's in front of Congress right now, and the president is pushing hard, and actually operationalize it into specific projects that serve today's and tomorrow's needs. So with that, let me turn it over to Secretary David Kim.
Great. Thanks so much, John, and thank you to the members of the media for joining us. Let me start by saying that this strategic partnership would be big news under any circumstances, but I think it's especially noteworthy given the current challenges surrounding the global supply chain. And I think we're all aware that the pandemic clearly put a spotlight on California's ports and the importance of our state's infrastructure in moving goods throughout the U.S. and around the world. But I do want to emphasize that we are experiencing global supply chain challenges, not limited to California, and there are issues to address that require both short and long-term solutions. And as John mentioned, the Biden-Harris Task Force on Supply Chain Disruptions and the Newsom administration have already taken steps to address supply chain disruptions in the short term, and that includes the governor's recent executive order that calls on state agencies to identify additional ways to alleviate congestion at California ports. But it is also important to point out that we're never going to solve this problem with immediate steps alone. We need long-term action too, and that's what today's announcement is all about. And so this agreement focuses on a long-term solution to expand the capacity and resiliency of supply chain infrastructure in California's major trade corridors, and that includes around San Pedro Bay and the Inland Empire. And the goal is to advance a more efficient goods movement system that will quickly deliver benefits to U.S. consumers and flex California's power in global trade. Now, a lot of focus right now is on how supply chain disruptions could impact holiday shopping, but we also need to think about what we can do so our system will be equipped to respond much better to future stress points so we can avoid similar disruptions years from now. Now, I think you know the numbers. The ports of LA and Long Beach move roughly 35% of all containers in the U.S., and altogether, about 40% of U.S. imports and 25% of U.S. exports transit through the San Pedro Bay port complex, and all indications point to much greater demand in the years ahead. In fact, by 2045, imports to California are projected to increase 120% and exports more than 300%. So we fully recognize the need to act now in partnership with the federal government and regional stakeholders to add more capacity and resiliency to California's supply chain infrastructure to clear out choke points and meet future demand. And that will require comprehensive upgrades to our supply chain infrastructure, not just one-off projects here or there, which is the way it has traditionally been done, but rather through a strategic network of related projects that, taken together, will help grow the economy, improve the environment, facilitate the movement of goods, and strengthen supply chain resilience throughout California and the U.S. so we can avoid being in this position many years from now. So the state is now working hand in hand with regional stakeholders to identify major projects that fit that profile and are in a position to begin construction in the next few years. John mentioned a few of the broad categories: port-specific upgrades, rail yard expansion and electrification, grade-separated crossings, and various others. But one thing I want to stress is that today's announcement is not about any specific project. It's about an innovative federal-state partnership that gives California the flexibility and support to build a comprehensive state program to address supply chain challenges. John called it a hunting license, and I think that's a perfect description. This federal support also puts the projects in a very strong position to compete for other funding sources at all levels: federal, state, private investment. And one important point I'd like to make: these supply chain resilience projects are all being considered through an equity and environmental justice lens at both the federal and state level. This is critically important given the fact that areas near ports have been disproportionately impacted by emissions for a very long time. But through this effort, we very much believe we're setting the stage for projects that will eliminate bottlenecks and improve the flow of goods in and around California ports. And that, in turn, will have a positive impact in reducing emissions with fewer idling trucks and ships at sea. And on top of that, potential projects also include electrification and expanding capacity for cleaner methods of goods movement, including freight rail and zero-emission drayage trucks. Also want to mention that California is already investing in supply chain infrastructure thanks to Senate Bill 1, and that landmark legislation enables us to invest $54 billion over a decade and more ongoing to fix roads, freeways, and bridges throughout California, including increased funding for improvements to essential trade corridors. And the recently enacted state budget includes $250 million for ports, along with $280 million for infrastructure projects at and around the Port of Oakland, and $1.3 billion over 3 years for zero-emission trucks, transit buses, and school buses, including more than 1,000 zero-emission port dredge trucks. So combining all of these current efforts with today's announcement really lays the groundwork for a federal-state partnership at its very best. And we're so proud to work with the Biden-Harris administration on long-term solutions that will bolster California's infrastructure and strengthen resilience throughout the supply chain. So thanks very much for your time. And with that, John and I are happy to answer any questions.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press 1, then 0 on your telephone keypad. You may withdraw your question at any time by repeating the command of 1, then 0. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions or comments, please press 1, then 0 at this time. And our first question will come from the line of Russ Mitchell, Los Angeles Times. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I'd just like clarification on the hunting license idea. I didn't see a lot of detail about this network you're talking about or individual kinds of investments and how they would all interrelate. Hunting license indicates that you're just out there scouting around trying to figure out what we need to do. Which indicates that maybe the state and the federal government don't know. So could you explain this hunting license idea?
Sure, Russ. This is John, and since I'm the one that said hunting license, maybe I should start here. What an emerging projects agreement is allocating loan capacity from both the TIFIA and RIF loan programs. They're both 35-year loan programs for long-lived infrastructure at a very low interest rate, and they can be used, for example, to cover up to 50% of the project cost. So in many cases, some or most of the local share of the project can be financed through one of those two programs. The capacity has been allocated and set aside for the state of California, and the state, I won't speak for David, he'll want to mention this, they know in broad terms the types of projects, and in some cases specific projects that are likely all through the goods chain that need to be improved. There's community consultation, as David mentioned, equity and other and environmental considerations that will need to be taken into account. But I think you could talk to the owners and the operators of this private sector goods chain, and they would have a very good idea of the specific projects. I would also comment that this applies statewide. So while we're focused on Southern California for the most part, and the Inland Empire and the two ports, Los Angeles and Long Beach, the agreement is statewide, giving the state maximum flexibility. David?
Okay, but could you explain what you mean by hunting license?
Yeah. So instead of having one at a time sequentially to identify a project, go through a loan pre-approval process, and do that sequentially, what you actually have is a commitment from the federal government to work with the state on a variety of projects that the state selects across the board concurrently. So you don't have to do these one at a time. They can be done concurrently. And the idea of if you're going to comprehensively address the goods supply chain, you need not one, not two, but a whole program of projects. And you can move that program of projects concurrently through the approval process rather than consecutively.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It still doesn't answer. It doesn't answer the question. I'll only ask one more and give other people a chance. But when you go, what are you hunting for? Who is hunting, and what are they trying to find?
The state is actually putting together a comprehensive capital program for goods movement improvements. And this federal program is designed to give the state the maximum flexibility in putting together that program and moving it through the process much more quickly than it otherwise could.
Okay. Well, you didn't answer my question, but thank you for trying.
Russ, this is David. In addition to hunting license, another term that could apply here is matchmaking.
I'm not asking about another term. What do you mean by hunting license? You both use the term, and I'm trying to figure out what you mean.
Russ,
when you go hunting, you go
identifying
out with a gun.
It's identifying specific projects that are eligible for TIFIA and RIF loans or RIF loans that together these projects can significantly improve the goods supply chain.
All right.
Right.
Thank you.
And on that point, what I will say to you, Russ, is that we are in active conversation with a whole range of regional and local stakeholders to identify potential projects that fit in these categories. The other thing I would point you to is the California Freight Mobility Plan, which came out less than a year ago. And that plan lays out a series of potential freight improvement infrastructure projects. And that gives you a rough idea of the universe of potential projects that could potentially move forward through this partnership and others as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And our next question comes from the line of Michael Sasso, Bloomberg News. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. Just clarifying the structure of this partnership, would there be people from the state or the federal government dedicated to this full time? Just to walk me through how this would be structured, and we'll start with that.
Yeah, Michael, this is John. The Build America Bureau, which is a unit within the U.S. Department of Transportation that administers the finance programs, will actually be the federal staff counterpart for this. The Build America Bureau will work directly with CalSTA as they develop this program of projects and build a funding and or financing plan for each of the projects that are under this umbrella. It'll be a federal-state partnership in the sense that the state identifies the project priorities, the federal government identifies the federal loan components and processes them on an expedited basis.
Then finally, would you just kind of walk me through the process of, if you could, just the state identifies the project, and then what's the next step? Does it go to this partnership for vetting? I mean, what's the process for getting funding from the government or and matching funds from private sources? Just walk us through how practically one project might come to fruition out of this.
Yeah, in a program of projects, you're going to have public projects, you're going to have public-private partnerships, and so the funding sources can be both public and private or a blend of the two. It would be a concurrent process where the Build America Bureau at USDOT is working side by side with the state as they develop that program of projects. And as the scope, the size of each project are determined, on the federal side, you can then figure out the required loan element that would make it happen. The idea is to leverage state investments and state funding through this long-term loan program, allowing the state to build much more than they otherwise would be able to afford because it's long-lived infrastructure and it's a 35-year loan program.
Our next question comes from the line of Dan Bach, Crane, Chicago Business. Please go ahead.
Hi there. I'm worried or concerned, I guess, about if the bottlenecks get cleared up and they go farther away, particularly to Chicago. I'm curious, is this similar to the CREATE program that's in the Chicago area? And if not, is this a model that, the railroads in Chicago might be looking at as far as this partnership with the federal government?
Dan, it's an excellent question. And the CREATE project, the CREATE program of projects actually predates what we're talking about today. There are elements of CREATE that do use the TIFIA and RIF loan programs, but this is a step beyond it. And frankly, we hope that other states will follow in California's footsteps and think comprehensively about goods movement within their state and among the states. And these emerging projects agreements are structured to have them do exactly that. So you could take a state's long-term freight and goods movement plan, which typically identifies projects, and you can turn that into a funded program through this emerging projects agreement. It does not today. It's California who's the pioneer in this. It certainly has broader implications, and as a nation, we should be looking at this coast to coast.
And if the state wanted to get sort of something similar, what would they be doing, or what should they be doing to get prepared for that?
Well, the first thing they should do is follow the California model of thinking holistically and intermodally about the goods movement chain, both within their borders and beyond it, its connections to other states. And that's a discussion that the Biden administration would encourage at any time they're ready.
And again, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press 1, then 0. Again, that's 1, then 0 for any questions or comments. And we have a question in line from Tony McAllister, Patch Media. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm out here in the Inland Empire, and I'm curious what your response is to the population out here where there is quite a significant pushback against logistics out here, and it's expanding at a rapid rate. What would be your response to people out here?
Well, one of the things that, just speaking from the federal level, that we've heard clearly and consistently on the Inland Empire is that things like at-grade rail crossings separate communities. And the kinds of projects that can be funded under this emerging projects agreement, as David mentioned, are things like rail at-grade crossing elimination projects. So reconnecting communities, respecting from both an environmental and an equity point of view that projects serve people, not the other way around, is baked into this formula. David, do you want to comment?
Yes, Tony, that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, all of these projects will be considered through an equity and environmental justice lens at both the federal, state, and local level. And so that's going to be a key consideration. An example where you are, since you're in the Inland Empire, is the Colton Crossing project, which was funded in large part by the federal government about 10 or 12 years ago in San Bernardino County. Excellent example of separating tracks operated by two separate freight rail companies. And it has all sorts of community environmental benefits by doing that. So that's an example, and we're going to be looking for similar projects in the future.
Thank you.
And our next question is from the line of David Lightman, McClatchy. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for doing this. I'm trying to boil this into simple journalistic English. First of all, is this the first time this federal-state partnership involving these loan programs has ever been tried? Do I have that right?
You do, David, in the sense that individual loan applications from states for both the TIFIA and RIF program have come in before. This is the first time it's ever been done comprehensively in a federal-state partnership that looks to do a whole program of projects rather than one project.
Right. So the first time on this scale. Now, second question, are these loan programs on the books already, or are they in the infrastructure bill that Congress is still considering?
Another great question. These programs exist. They exist right now. They're funded. They both the TIFIA and the RIF program have a solid track record of building infrastructure projects around the country, they've never been packaged in this kind of federal-state partnership way before.
Okay. So the next question, what is in the infrastructure bill for these programs, if anything?
Both of these programs are actually funded through the appropriations process. Both currently have adequate capacity for this and other projects around the country. What the bipartisan infrastructure bill adds to that, which is very significant, is, for example, for the first time, significant funding for ports. So $17 billion for ports in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And it's a recognition that ports that serve the entire nation's economy are beyond the capacity of individual jurisdictions to fund by themselves.
And David, I would add, getting back to your question on TIFIA and RIF loans, any project sponsor that can receive a TIFIA or RIF loan is very lucky, because these are favorable loan repayment terms, and it's a major accomplishment for any project sponsor to get a TIFIA or RIF loan. And so through this partnership, we think the chances of success are much greater as a result of the technical assistance that will be provided by the Build America Bureau and all of their staff expertise.
And at this time, there are no other questions in queue. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our conference today. Thank you for your participation and for using AT&T conferencing service. You may now disconnect.